What you're getting at too is that was one of those, like etiology, like placing myth on top of something real in order to make it understandable. Maybe not meant to be diabolical, but there was, I believe it was, the Trinity was created to be able to accommodate, not because it existed and they had to figure out how to make it work. God revealed it. Well, did God reveal that, or is it? And it's so hard because I do believe that there is a God. I do believe there is a creator. I believe that I've started using the word originator, and I got to tell you, it was a wacky.
Welcome to the One-on-One Podcast with your host, Juan Ayala.
And welcome back to another episode of the One-on-One Podcast. I'm your host as always. Make sure to follow me on social media at the One-on-One Podcast on all social media platforms. Check out the Patreon, check out the Telegram, check out all that shit. You know where to find me. Today we got Scotty Roberts with us. What's up, Scotty?
How you doing? Sorry, I had just a little phase out on my sound there, so I didn't quite catch it till the very end. So I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
You prefer Scotty or Scott?
You know, I'm Scott according to my publisher and professionals, and I'm Scotty according to other professionals. That started when I was a kid. It picked up when I was in advertising 30 years ago, and they all called me Scotty R. It's Scotty R's here today. And when I was freelancing for some of them, and so it just stuck. Everybody started calling me that. So now I use it as a pen name, kind of.
Scotty, can you tell the listeners a little bit about you, can you plug your show? Tell the listeners where they can find your show, your books, because you have a lot of great material and a great show as well.
Well, you can find my show over at Odyssey Radio. Now, that's just in audio format because it is a radio station, and that's at odysy.radio.com. And I simulcast every night on my YouTube. And so you can hear the audio at the radio station, then you can see the video, just like we're doing here over on youtube.com/Scotty Roberts. And you can find just about anything there is to know about me at my website, which is, I started this website because my publisher wanted my full name. So it's ScottAlanRoberts.com. And Alan is A-L-A-N. Because there's a million ways to spell Alan. So ScottAlanRoberts.com. And I'm on all the social media platforms and yada, yada. You can find me. I'm pretty easy to find. My phone number is everywhere. You can even call me. I've had people call me at 2 a.m. Go, hey, I wanted to talk to you about the Nephilim, man. And I'm like, yeah, sure, dude. It's 2 o'clock here.
So, well, I didn't call you. I reached out to you via email, so that's good.
You did.
And I seen that you've been to Egypt. You've done a lot of things, and you have a similar origin story, although you're probably a little bit older than I am. A similar origin story of when you got into this whole paranormal and asking those hard questions. I also have a friend of mine who he's an ex-evangelist, preacher, all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then he started pulling at that thread. And when you start pulling at that thread, it starts to unravel. And you get to some places. He looks at it where God, because I believe in God. I do think that there is a source. You got to respect that. There is something there. It's just to put a name and a face to it is a whole different thing. And he sees it as a good thing where, his path was to unravel that thread and where he's at now. Can you tell a little bit about your story to the listeners of what got you into this whole thing?
Sure. I started out as a Bible school guy. I went to Bible college, and this will show our age difference. I went to Bible college my freshman year in 1978, and I went for a couple of years, and then I went off to seminary after that, and I worked on my master's degree in seminary and never finished that, and ended up going into advertising. And so I spent many years in advertising, but alongside of my work, I was doing youth pastor work. So I was a youth director in a couple of different churches, and had a good time doing that, really enjoyed it. But my questioning, well, like you said, when you pull that thread and it starts to unravel a bit, there was a thread that was sticking out, and it's so funny that it is the thing that I have written about the most in my adult life. When I was in seminary, I had a question about the passage that spoke about the Nephilim, and I asked one of my professors, who happened to be a history. He was an archaeologist. He was and major is not the word I'm looking for. His specialty was history. He was a historian, and he was the guy that actually first got me very interested in Egyptology and in history altogether. When I was 11 years old, and in a Sunday school class, I was given a report to do on the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And he said, the teacher at the time was one of the seminary students there. And he said, why don't you go talk to Chucky Ailing? And so I looked up Chucky Ailing and gave him a phone call as an 11-year-old kid. And we met after church one Sunday. And he went on to be a Dr. Charles Ailing, and he was the president of our seminary, and then he went on to be the chair of history at the University of Northwestern up here in Minnesota. And he's now, I think, or he was at least the president of the Near Middle East Archaeological Society. And so I've known this man for years, but he's the guy that got me in. And he was one of the guys in seminary I was asking this question of, what about the Nephilim? I said, who are these guys? The passage in the English text says, and the sons of God came down and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. And it goes into the account of the Nephilim. And I said, who were these guys? And the president of the seminary happened to be having coffee with us at the time. And he said, oh, it's not what you think. I know where you're going with this. It's some kind of wild story. And I said, now, wait, though. You guys teach us that language means things. And I said, and that's why we have to take Hebrew. That's why we have to take Koine Greek. That's why we have to take Aramaic in seminary so we can understand these passages better. I said, in the Hebrew, this passage says, the B'nai Ha Elohim, the sons of the God of many gods, came down and intermingled with the daughters of Adam, of mankind. I said, that's contrasted. That's the sons of God, the daughters of men, and they had children by them. I said, so if there's a contrast there, what does that mean? And I was told, well, now that was probably just the aristocrats, the sons of the aristocrats who went down slumming in the valley with the common women and had children by them. I said, innocently, I asked, so why doesn't the text just say that? Why does it say something else? Yeah. And then I got kind of it was all very good natured. Nobody was upset or heated or anything. And the president of the seminary said, kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. He says, let's just not go there. We aren't going to go there. Just keep that quiet. We don't need to worry about that. And he wasn't trying to hide anything. He just didn't want to get into it. He didn't have any other way to explain it that fit into Baptistic. This was a Baptist fundamentalist conservative school. And he said they just did not want to have to deal with those kinds of questions. And if they did, they found commonplace, just like you do with skeptics and ghosts and skeptics and Bigfoot and all of these different kinds of things. Skeptics will always look for the easy jump to answer to explain it away, as opposed to let's think a little harder and find out what this really means. And so that's where all the way back at my beginnings of my adult career, when I was still in school, working on my Master of Divinity to become, a minister. And back then I was already questioning things. That thread had already started to unravel. And what that led to was not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I didn't say, well, God must not exist. I said, well, we obviously don't know the answers to everything that we think are all right in front of our faces. And so I pretty much spent the last 40 years trying to research these things and get answers to my questions.
I grew up Pentecostal Christian. I mean, I've said this a bunch of times on the show.
Praise Jesus.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not mocking anybody. I'm just having fun.
And the speaking in tongues. I played guitar for the worship group for 5 years. I traveled playing at different churches on Sundays. I went to juvies. I went to other churches to play. I did it all. And then, but nothing in me ever do I remember, because I was raised by my grandma. I don't ever remember wanting to go to church, like actually wanting to go. Yeah. I stayed because, again, it was a familial thing, was tradition. And I just went because I had an obligation. I had a responsibility. But there was always something in me that never really clicked. And I remember one time, Pentecostals, they faint, they speak in tongues, they run around. I remember one time there was this preacher. I think he was blind, and he was praying for me. And I remember every time whenever he was praying over me, I remember him pushing on the front of my the front of my head, like pushing. And I'm like trying to keep my head up. I'm like, what are you doing, man? But I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to get me to fall over, because that's what they all do. They all fall over, they meditate, whatever, and then they get back up.
Right.
So I always think about that part,
yes.
But I started to ask those hard questions. I asked even, family members. I'm like, hey, why does the Old Testament say this and the New Testament say that? I had a family member tell me one time, hey, ignore the Old Testament. Ignore it. And I go, well, they have become like one of us, all like the Holy Trinity. Oh, okay. They always have some answer to everything. And then when they can't answer it, they go, oh, you have to meditate. You have to ask God.
And what was interesting was that the Judaism didn't recognize a Trinity. At the time that those things were written, there was no Trinity. So that was not representative of Trinity when it said they have become just like us.
Yeah, that came after the fact, thousands of years after the fact. And,
yes.
When you start to ask these questions, you start going down these rabbit holes. And I forgot the term that my friend uses in these schools, in these Bible schools, and these pastor schools, where they teach you pretty much, it's a form of NLP where they teach you how to manipulate people's thoughts in a way. And I forgot the name that he uses for it, but where
I don't know what that term is.
Where you're trying to, they always ask a question with another question. I forget. Anyway, that's on one of my episodes probably, but I've always wondered, I'm like, they have to teach you how to read people, how to read body language, how to answer questions, these hard questions. Cause you're standing on what people will die for, beliefs, faith, and all these things. So it's a very delicate thing to shift somebody's paradigm for forever. Cause this is a lifestyle for some people if they choose to go to church, which there's nothing wrong with that. I do think that religion is a powerful tool. And if used correctly, it can make you a better person. It gives you structure in your life, and it gives you morals and good beliefs. Again, and I always tell people, I respect anyone's beliefs. If you want to worship Cthulhu or whoever the hell you want to worship, then that's on you. And you can, as long as you don't hurt yourself.
You figure that out with God. I tell people, you figure that out with God yourself.
This topic, one of the topics that has always interested me has been the Nephilim. topic, the Nephilim, the Elohim, the Watchers, the fallen angels, and all these things. Can we get into, because you wrote a book, and you wrote the Reptilian book after the fact, correct?
Yes, the Reptilian was actually the follow-up to my book on the Nephilim. The Nephilim I'd been planning for years, and then I wrote an article for a magazine, and that's when I was asked to do the book for New Page Books. And that article is pretty much revamped. That's the introduction to the book when you pick up the book. I happen to have one right here. I just happen to have my book for $20.95. No, I'm kidding. You can buy this on Amazon. It's everywhere. But this was the book, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. And, the intro was the old article that I kind of revamped and beefed it up a little bit for the book. So I had, like I mentioned, I had lots of questions about this and spent a lot of time digging into it. I don't have all the answers, but I kind of got very myopic on certain elements of the Nephilim story and wanted to zero in and find out, okay, who were these guys? Why were they? What's the language say? But then you'll have other people who come along and interpret it completely differently. And I try to use some of what I was taught, which is go back to the original languages, find out what the languages say. And of course, Nephilim, what's the source point of the Nephilim? It's the book of Genesis. But the book of Genesis is obviously a copy of the book of Enoch. It's some of the very same verbiage is used. You got 4 verses in Genesis 6.
It predates it by 700 years, correct? 700, yes. 800 years?
And people say, well, the book of Enoch, that was written in the 400s BC. Well, no, I think it was copied in the 400 BCs. What they're confusing is that the whole Old Testament was technically written in the 400s BCE because after the Babylonian captivity, Israel was sent back. The Israelites were sent back home. They rebuilt the walls of the temple and the temple itself. And what did they do? They sent a bunch of rabbis, as the story goes, 72 rabbis, to Ptolemy II, the Grecian, Greco-Roman pharaoh of Egypt at that time, and asked permission to go to the Library of Alexandria to camp out for a while and look up all the old and Hebrew scriptures for 2 purposes. One was to bolster the faithful of Israel and to reestablish the chain of their history. And so they went to the Smithsonian of its day, the Library of Alexandria. And they spent, I think it was over a decade, rebuilding the Old Testament scriptures. So everything from Genesis all the way to the last book of the Old Testament, all those books were actually rewritten in the 400s BCE. And I think Enoch was among them. But when you have Moses, who I believe there is absolutely no reason to doubt that Moses was a real guy, that Moses, just like Abraham Lincoln, just like he's somebody who was a real dude in history, that he wrote those books, the first 5 books of the Bible. And if he did that, it's going on. That's where I looked into trying to set dating. When would he have done this? What would have been the things? What were the influences on him in writing it, and so on? But you take that 4-verse passage about the Nephilim at Genesis 6:1. You take a look at that. That's repeated. It's something that he pulled from the book of Enoch and placed into the book of Genesis. And so it's very interesting. And Moses did a lot of that. And I'm not saying this was a problem. This is just what was done back then when Moses led the people out of Egypt. I'm sure it would looked a little differently than we get in the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston or, the Prince of Egypt or things like that. But you've got the story of an emancipator, somebody who came and led his people out of the land. Whether there was divine intervention in that, we don't know for sure. But he leads them out. And he writes down the books of the law. He establishes Judaism. Judaism did not exist prior to Moses codifying it. And you can find the codification of that religion in the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, where he puts the law together. They build the tabernacle of the covenant, the big tented version of the temple on the world. So all of that to say, Moses created Judaism at that time based on more ancient religious practices and probably a mishmash of different prototype religions that existed prior to that.
He was 100%. He was an Egyptian scribe, right? Is what they've said that he was. He was 100%.
I think he was. Of course, we'll get a little off the Nephilim, although I mentioned this in the Nephilim book. I did it on purpose, by the way. I mentioned this whole Moses thing to bolster that. My publisher actually wanted me to pull that chapter out. He says, I don't know if that's a necessary chapter to the Nephilim. And I said, oh, but I think it is, because it establishes who first wrote about the Nephilim in the Old Testament and all of this. So, I believe that Moses was an Israelite, if you will, although Israelite didn't exist before Moses. So he was a Canaanite. He was of one of the Canaanite tribes. I believe that Joseph actually existed. You remember Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, as the play called it. But Joseph in the coat of many colors. His brothers were jealous of him, sold him into slavery. He's picked up, he's brought to Egypt, ends up going to prison, interprets a dream for the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh raises him to great power. And then 20 years later, his brothers come during famine, not even knowing he's alive anymore. Looking for a place in Egypt, and he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. We know that story. And by the way, this is a great historical point. If you don't indulge me and don't mind letting me make this, I believe Joseph, when people question that story. Well, why would an Egyptian pharaoh raise a Canaanite slave to the position of Grand Vizier, which Grand Vizier in Egypt in those days simply meant 1 foot off the throne. He was Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. And why would they elevate this guy? Well, I think the dating system works very well. When you start dating the Exodus, Moses, the time of Israel in Egypt, you go all the way back to the time of Joseph. I believe Joseph came to Egypt during the time when the Hyksos kings were on the throne. The Hyksos kings were, for about 800 years, all these people, Mesopotamia, from Asia Minor, Africa, they all started coming in from mostly the Middle East and settling into the villages and the towns, and they became part of the villages and towns. They became part of the municipal part of the towns. And after about 800 years of all this mingling in, the Hyksos peoples overtook the northern kingdom of Egypt and established their own throne, their own pharaonic dynasty that lasted for about 108 years before down in the south, the real Egyptians, the blood Egyptians, came and ousted them. And so during this 108-year period, it's interesting in the book of Genesis, in the language again, the words mean things. It says when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he's been missing for 20 years. They think him dead, and here he is, the Grand Vizier of Egypt. And once they all make good and everything, Joseph said, now I'm going to give you some of the best land in Egypt, but Pharaoh has to approve it. So when you go in to meet with Pharaoh, it says in the book of Genesis, tell him that you've been shepherds since the days of your youth, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. And I thought, now that makes no fucking sense. Oh, Sergeant, pardon me.
You're good.
I said, that makes no sense to me. Why would he say, tell the Egyptian Pharaoh that you're the thing that they hate the most? Well, as you start reading through this, you find that it becomes very apparent that Joseph is appealing to a king who is one of these Hyksos, these shepherding kings, they were called. They were part of, in a sense, they were distant shoestring cousins in their background, their heritage. And then when you had, after the time of Joseph, a generation passes, and it says that the Pharaoh came to the throne who had no idea who Joseph was and had no regard for Joseph. This would have been Amos the first. This would have been the king that ousted the Hyksos. And he's got all these remnant of these Middle Eastern peoples, including the clan that Joseph was from, the clan of Jacob or Israel. And it was a clan name, a family name. And what did he do? It says he slapped them all into bondage and in servitude, it says right there in the Bible, he did this lest they rise up and join our enemies again against us. And so you've got great clues in there. So Joseph, I think, came to power under the Hyksos king. And then they were all slapped into servitude. I don't think it was like slavery and they're all chained up on a wall together at night. I think it was just like, you are a subjugated people now. You'll do what the Pharaoh tells you to do, or you're done. And so he put them all into bondage. And this is what they did until the time of Moses.
Yeah, one of the things about history, right, his story, because to the victor, the spoils, one of the things is that a lot of the times, because I don't know if it was you that I heard say this, or it was somebody else, where historically the Bible is okay. But then when you start to take it for a literal sense, like an actual thing, that's where the problem comes in, because a lot of these stories, it was you, most definitely, that I heard say, when they saw Moses part the sea, why the fuck would they want to have a golden calf made or something? It's like, you just saw this guy.
Well,
part the sea.
We know 3 weeks ago we saw the miraculous hand of God part the waters of the sea and then drown all the Egyptians. But let's build a golden calf to worship. That made no sense to me.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I'm pretty sure you've ran into the whole, who do I say that sent me? Well, I am that I am. It's like, well, who's that? You know what I mean? And I'm pretty sure it was you that broke something down that blew my mind. Can you get into that a little bit?
It blew my mind. It blew my mind when I found it. I know exactly what you're talking about. And by the way, I have said about the history of the Bible, I said, I believe the history of the Bible is efficacious. It's there. It's meaningful. It's intact. You've had more than 1,500 different accounts of history in the Old Testament be verified by archaeological finds. That does not necessarily mean the faith that's wrapped around those stories is accurate. It's an interpretation when you put the faith on it. But in the scene where Moses encounters the burning bush, he's been now, according to the story, 40 years since he's left Egypt. He's an old man now. He's in his 80s. And he's been like a sheikh out in Midian in the middle of the Sinai. And so he meets God in the burning bush. And now people question this too, but keep in mind, Moses was the only guy there. And he just wrote down what happened. Oh, this is what happened to me at the burning bush. So did it happen exactly like he says? We don't know for sure. But he was the guy that was there. It was his experience. It would be like reading a book by Whitley Strieber, who wrote the book Communion about his alien abductions. He was the guy that it happened to. It's his story. This is the same with Moses. And so Moses writes this down, but remember, he kind of, you can almost see this, he gives all his excuses. Oh, I'm slow of speech. I can't talk. I'm no orator. And God said, who made man's mouth? He says, you're fine. You can handle this. And so
he was
finally,
giving God excuses?
Yeah, he's giving him excuses. I can't go deliver these people. Who am I to talk to Pharaoh?
My hands hurt.
And God says, you're who I made you to be.
Yeah.
And so finally, Moses says, and there's a lot packed into this account. You almost see the scene. It's almost where he kind of leans in a bit to God or to the bush, and leans in a bit and goes, so, okay, I'll go to Egypt, like you say. Whom shall I say sent me? And you can see God's response is almost like, it's none of your goddamn business what my name is. You tell them I am sent you. I am that I am they speak of. I am that I am. And it's such a puzzling phrase because it's transliterated into English. I am that I am. I am that I am. I am is the antecedent of the word that. I am that I am. Now, what's interesting about it, I didn't hear this till about 10 years ago when I first heard this. That phrase is actually a Mesopotamian wordplay that Moses incorporated into the text. Or you could say maybe it was a later editor that incorporated it. We don't know for sure. I think it's in the original text as far back as we can go. And so Moses wrote down that God said, I'll tell you what my name is. My name is, you tell them I am. I am sent you. I am that I am. Well, that Mesopotamian wordplay literally means in Mesopotamia, which is Sumer, Akkad, and all of those places, the Sumerians and all, I am that I am. That phrase meant I am that Enki they speak of, is what the phrase means. That Iyah, Enki's other name. In Sumer, he was known as Enki. In Akkad, he was known as Iyah. It's, by the way, which is 1,500 years later in Canaan, when my religion migrated down there. Enki, Iyah is the same base word for Yahweh, which is the Hebrew word or the Canaanite word for Jehovah. And
where'd you get that from, Scotty? So you that's just linguistics. I couldn't tell you the exact source. I have used Dr. Michael S. Heiser, who is a ancient linguist. I've seen it in other locations. I've seen another guy that's written extensively, not because he's unimportant, but because I just had a brain fart. The guy who's written about Exodus quite a bit, David Rohl, R-O-H-L. David Rohl. I was having a conversation with him, and he told me that he showed me this long thing about how he broke this all down, the linguistics of this. Okay, that's fucking crazy if you really come to think about it. But it doesn't surprise me because you're saying he's a Canaanite. You know, they talk about what's that one, the child sacrifice god, the one that we always Moloch. They talk about Moloch in there, which that was a Canaanite god. You know, the where they sacrifice all the kids. So it wouldn't surprise me because, again, the ancient Mesopotamian Sumer itself really paved the way for our religions. And I mean, you have the story of Atrahasis, Noah, you have all these different stories that the Zoroastrians, that's kind of the same thing, just repackaged. The Hindu Trinity was the original Trinity.
Yes.
You know, so it wouldn't surprise me, but that blew my mind when you brought that up. I was like, what the fuck? But it wouldn't, because I mean, a lot of our
that blew my mind the first time I heard that. You know, what's interesting, you talk about how it's a repackaged design to these stories. When you start looking at the Garden of Eden story and Adam and Eve and the interaction with the serpent character, who is never called Satan or the devil or Lucifer in the Genesis passage, that came 1,000 years later. They attributed it to him. He's known as Nakash in the Hebrew language. Nakash means it's not a direct interpretation, meaning serpent, but the bright shining one, the serpentine one. It was used when Moses raised the brass serpent on a pole so people would be healed when they were all bitten by snakes after the Exodus, while they're all wandering in the desert for 40 years.
And that's where the linguistics for Nagas comes in too, right?
Yes. Well, he called that snake on the pole, the brass snake, was called the Nakashte, which was the brazen serpent. The Nakash was the serpent character in the Garden of Eden story. And it means a bright shining one, prince, the bringer of forbidden knowledge, and so on, and things like that. Now, take all of that story in Genesis, though, and go back 1,500 years to the Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki, the Anu, and how that Elil, the chief god of the Anunnakis, they were tired of doing their own labor, their own digging their canals and mining their resources and tilling their ground. And so he went to Enki, his brother god, lesser god, and conscripted him, so to speak, to create, as it says in the old cuneiform text, create primordial man to do our work for us. And so Enki goes about and he creates primordial man. And what do they do? It says primordial man is there to work for the god Enlil, Elil, the same name, and to work for the Anunnaki, to till the ground for them, to dig their resources, to dig their canals and trenches. And what happens? Atrahasis, who you just mentioned, Atrahasis, the king of Eridu, comes along and appeals to his god, their patron god, Enki, to please come and deliver us from the bondage we have to the gods, to the Anunnaki. Deliver us, and bend your ear to your servant.
I love the story. I love that story.
I do too.
When he tells him what to do, he's like a wall or something. And he's like, well, I didn't tell him directly. He's like,
yeah.
Where's this coming from? It's like a wall, or he's like on the other side of the wall, and the wall tells him.
Yes. And so it's interesting that what happens? Enki comes down with his followers. They fight for Atrahasis. They give him all the forbidden knowledge, and they're freed from bondage to the Anunnaki. And what happens? Elil then, in great anger, wants to cast Enki and all his followers into the subterranean caverns of the earth to dwell forever. Now, fast forward 1,500 years. God creates man, places man in the garden to do what? To till the ground and keep it for him. And gives him a command, you shall not eat of this tree, or these trees, it ended up being. And all these commands, mankind does it anyway. Mankind falls, mankind is cast out, and the serpent character Nakash is cast to the ground. And of course, we have all the mythology of Satan and hell and the subterranean caverns of the earth and so on. So, and Elil, the chief god of the Anunnaki, that's the same base word for El in the Canaanite culture, which was the word for God, which is what the Hebrews used. God, El, Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon, all these names for God. Enki, of course, Enki, Yahweh. And the parallels are unbelievable. So the big question is, was there a proto-religion that Moses drew from? Did he borrow the story? Did he plagiarize the story and say, let's just change it up a little bit? So I think Moses created Judaism out of whole cloth. You even look at the layouts, temple, the holy place, and the holy of holies, and the way the temple is set up, it mimics the way Egyptian temples are set up. You look at the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is an Egyptian bark shrine. They're all over the walls in Egypt. You can see them in hundreds of different places. And so all of these things were copies. And so there's something very interesting, too, about Moses that I have to bring up here. And it ties into this thing about recognizing who the gods were and so on. Do you remember the Old Testament tells us that Moses wrote in the book of Exodus, he wrote these words, "No man shall see God's face and live."
But you'll see his ass.
Yeah, you can see his ass, which is what Elijah did.
Yeah.
And I saw God walk by, and I saw his hinder portions.
Yes.
And
but I do remember that, absolutely.
So I've said unblasphemously, by the way, on something I don't want to do. Hey, Scotty, you ever going to do this thing again? Said the day God walks by me in a cloud and shows me his butt cheeks is the day I will do that again. So, so Moses wrote, "No man can see God's face and live." 9 verses later in the same chapter, it says, and Moses pitched his tent outside the camp, and there God would come to Moses' tent and meet with Moses face to face and converse with him as a man would talk to his friend. And I thought, well, wait, flip. 9 verses earlier, didn't Moses just say, "No man shall see God's face"?
That's the Holy Spirit. Is that what they say? That's the Holy Spirit. That's a different...
That's what they say. You know what I believe it is? And I don't just believe this. I think this is it. This is the answer to that. Moses, remember, for the first 40 years of his life, grew up in Egypt. He went to the school of the nobles, There's a lot of Jewish tradition outside of the Bible. Jewish tradition, Jewish writings, the Mishnah, the Mikveh, all these different writings. They talk about how Moses was a general in the Pharaoh's army, how Moses was a great prince, and Moses did all these things. If any of this is true at all, for 40 years of his life, he lived in this system. It says, even in the Bible where it says he went and he identified with his people, and it doesn't say like in the movies that he went down into the mud pits and started making bricks with them. It says he identified with them. It said he and his entourage were there observing his Hebrew brethren, and he felt sorrow in his heart for them, and he identified, these are my people, I'm Hebrew. I'm an Israelite by birth. It didn't change his standing. It wasn't a big secret. There was lots of integration. He was an adopted son of the Pharaoh. And so here you've got Moses now. He's grown up in this system. He's been schooled there. And all of a sudden, he is now the leader of a people with a 40-year gap in between where he's run away. Why did he run away? It said he murdered an Egyptian taskmaster. Now, what's interesting about even that event, the man that I think was Moses, and I wrote about this in my book on the Nephilim to establish who he was historically. I wrote about it in a different book, The Exodus Reality, but this guy right here, he's back behind the Bigfoot. Sorry. Here, let's remove the Bigfoot.
Is that a real casting?
There he is. It's a secondary casting, by the way. This was the Patterson-Gimlin.
Oh, that's awesome.
Bigfoot. So, and this was gifted to me.
Wow.
So there it is. That's the actual size of that.
That's crazy.
So it's a cast of a cast. But back there is Senenmut. And Senenmut was a grand vizier underneath the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. And without getting into all that history, this is who I think Moses was. And I go about establishing
what dynasty
that.
are we talking about? Because there's so many.
18th dynasty. This is 18th dynasty. So you're looking at about 1526, I think it was, is the year I've got pegged for right around then, the birth of Moses.
That's pretty
late. And there's reasons I do this. You can go, there's a hard, fast verse in the Bible that sets a dating system into play. It says in 1 Kings 6, verse 1, that Solomon, the son of David, that when he built the temple in Jerusalem, temple 1, that he laid the foundation stone, he started building the temple in a certain day on a certain month in 480 years after the Exodus. And now it's a round figure, 480. But we know that David would have lived in the mid-10th century BCE. His son Solomon followed him. So you can pretty much, there's not a lot of controversy, except for those who don't want to believe David or Solomon ever even existed, which I believe they did. And there's a lot of proof for it. But Solomon, he would have dedicated that temple right around 966 BCE. That would have been the date of the founding of Temple 1 in Jerusalem. Now, if you take that 480 years and you go back in time, 480 years since the coming out of Israel under Moses from Egypt. 480 years, you get 1445, 1446 BCE. And all you do, you go to the chronology of the kings of Egypt, which, oh my God, there's 5 of them. And they kind of shift all over the place, depending on who recognizes who's regency or co-regency or whatever. So you go by some of the standard, like the Oxford Standard dating system. You end up with 1446 BCE. Who's on the throne? A guy named Amenhotep II. Who is the son of Tutmosis the third? Who's the son of Tutmosis the second? Who's the son of Tutmosis the first? You've got that Moshe name is in there, that Moses name. And but there's another key element in history. This is how you decipher these things. So you got that pretty much established, but nothing that says Moses was born on this day. You don't find that anywhere. But remember, after the Exodus, They wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, according to the story. And then when Moses dies, Joshua takes over. What's the first military campaign they wage entering into the promised land, like within months of the death of Moses? It's Jericho, where you get the old spiritual, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. How they marched around the city and God miraculously tumbled the walls down. What's very interesting, you go to modern-day Jericho, and the archaeological tell of the ancient city of Jericho is there. I mean, Kathleen Kenyon was digging in there 100 years ago. And so the tell has been there forever. Well, what they found out about ancient Jericho is that they've dated the destruction of the city. They don't claim that it's necessarily the biblical story, but I felt like Indiana Jones for a second there. Remember in the first movie, he goes, "Didn't you guys ever go to Sunday school?" They have dated the destruction of the city to around 1405 BCE. All right? The city laid fallow and unrebuilt for 800 years. So it wasn't built up again. 800 years after 1400 is what? About 600 BCE. 600, when Jericho was finally re-inhabited and rebuilt. Well, they date that destruction to 1405 BC through artifacts and all the different things they find in the ruins there. And that's been dated that way for the last 100 years. Well, if the Exodus took place in 1445, 46 BCE, and they've got the destruction of Jericho between 1400 and 1405 BCE, you got 40 years right there. That's that 40 years of leaving Egypt, wandering in the wilderness. Joshua takes over, bam, goes in and starts defeating the land of Canaan. And he takes the city of Jericho. And this also firmly places the Exodus outside of Ramses II. The famous Ramses II was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He was about 250 years too late. His reign took place during that 800 years of Jericho not being occupied. So it couldn't have happened then. So all of this is all stuff that I write about in the book on the Nephilim, the rise and fall of the Nephilim, because I wanted to establish the veracity of the writing of Moses. This is the way I justified it. And this was another thing of mine. I had the Nephilim and from my youth, and I had the story of Moses from my youth, from when I was 11 years old, getting that information from Chucky Ailing. That information stuck with me my whole life. And I wanted to write about that. And so I wanted to squeeze this into my book on the Nephilim. And so then we did that. And then I did the Reptilians book. And then they let me write the book on the Exodus reality, which has all this stuff tucked into it. So
yeah, I remember being 10 or 11 years old reading about the book Revelation. And I mean, you could see how that could be. I remember my grandma telling me stories about how they were going to cut my head off if I, after the rapture came, they were going to cut my head off if I, in order to accept God again. It's like, no, you're going to have to get your head chopped. I was like, as a kid, that's so traumatizing.
We got the same thing.
Yeah, it's traumatizing. You know what I mean? Like as a 12-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid, that's crazy.
Right. We learned all that eschatological stuff. The doctrines of the end times. And when I was in the church youth group in the 70s, growing up as a kid, we learned all that stuff and heard about all that stuff. And had to study it in Bible college and seminary. And got preached to about it in church. So we knew, the age of grace came at the resurrection of Christ, started the age of grace. That's going to end when the rapture comes. When the rapture comes, starts the 7-year tribulation. Mm-hmm. After the tribulation, the battle of Armageddon and the 1,000-year millennial kingdom of Christ on earth. This is what we were taught. So,
can we go back a little bit? Because, we're talking about the Anunnaki. We're talking about their creation story. There's, this is why I relate and I love the Gnostic worldview because, again, it puts a different twist on it. But we have to understand that the demiurge concept, it's Platonic, right? It's Plato came up with it, the Neoplatonists, and then, they paved the way for Christianity. And then you have the Gnostics, the early Gnostic sects, first, second, third century, and then obviously they were wiped out because, again, to the victor the spoils. When you're preaching heresies, you're gonna get burned at the stake, right?
Right.
So the whole Anunnaki story, the one thing that really irks me because you were talking about, they made man in order, it was a creation, they did it to mine for gold. I'm like, why would such a powerful entity or a highly advanced alien race, why the fuck would they need us to help them if they're so advanced? And I mean, I know you've talked to Eric Von Daniken, and he's all about the whole, UFO alien shit. It's like, what would a highly advanced race want to do with us? Why wouldn't they just do it themselves and there have been minds that have been proven to be hundreds of thousands of years old. So, I mean, somebody was mining for gold.
I think it's like, I look at it like the Spanish conquistadors coming to Central America, enslaving the Arawaks, enslaving the Cunas in Panama. Why did they do that? Didn't they have more advanced technology for doing this? Yeah, but it was easier with advanced weapons to have the common folk do it for you. Now, I have to put this one caveat on everything. None of us were there. None of us knows how it really came down. Is this all etiological stories, which are mythologies created in order to explain things that happen to the common folk? Great either geologic events or great this or great that, and we explain them away by putting stories on them.
I would have to agree with that, Scotty, because the rhetoric and the art of memory, one of the techniques that you use for that, especially when you're building a mind palace, is make up a crazy story. So crazy and so extravagant that you're going to remember it when you go to recite it. And back then, the only thing that would be written down in cuneiform or any tablets, what had to be super important. And not only that, but you needed to know how to write, and you needed to have the materials to write. So you're just telling stories back and forth with people, and eventually somebody comes along and goes, hey, I remember that from this crazy story. Because even with Pythagoras and Iamblichus, where there are parallels with the story of Jesus Christ and Pythagoras. Yeah. And it's like, well, maybe Iamblichus was like, hey, let me remember this by saying that he guessed how many fish there were, when he first pulled up. And, well, that's the same story they told about Jesus Christ. It's the same story they tell about Pythagoras and how he was born of a virgin as well. And it was the Oracle of Delphi told them that, hey, you're going to have this son and he's going to be one of the greatest minds of all time. It's like, well, it sounds very eerily similar to the story of Mary and Jesus Christ and all this stuff.
Certainly does.
So, again, I have to agree 100% with that, where it's the rhetoric and the art of memory, where you need to come up with a crazy story. Not only that, but nationalism as well. My guys are the best.
Why do all these tribal cultures from ancient times, it's like Native American culture, even you've got, Great Bear fought the battle with Great Wolf and killed him and slung him into the sky by his tail, and his entrails made the Milky Way, or whatever it is. Those stories were created for the common mind or the child to grasp onto. And I think they were only meant to be stories when they originated. So I think you see a lot of this. I don't know exactly what point we were on when we side trailed off onto that, but all of these stories that exist, you've got to start to try to find ways to decipher what's a story and what's a real event that took place. And this is where I think you can look at historical events and say these things happened. You can look at, I'm speaking Old Testament wise, you can say, well, we found this and this and this and all these things that set proofs for archaeological record or for historical record to be proved. There are other things you can't prove. You can pretty much prove, and when I use the term secondary historical evidence, because it's not direct. You have nothing that says, and the Hebrews took this route, the Bob's Highway to the east through to the Red Sea. It doesn't say that in there. It doesn't say any of these things in there, but they give you the story, the account of what they did, but then they tack on the stories of faith on top of them.
Mm-hmm.
The Red Sea parting and so on. Was that a geologic event? Was it a spiritual event? We don't know for sure.
I saw a meme on that subject. I saw a meme where it was like two Roman soldiers, and one of them asked the other one, he's like, "Hey, what year is it?" He's like, 300 BC. He's like, BC? He's like, yeah, before Christ. And the guy goes, who the fuck is Christ?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I tend to believe, I have studied Gnosticism, ancient mysticism, not researched it like a lifestyle, but tried to study to get a handle on it, because first century Christianity was very different than the Christianity we have today.
Fascinating.
It's utterly fascinating. And what you had for the next 200 years was literally a war between the Gnostics and the mystics, Eastern mysticism, Mediterranean mysticism, at war with the burgeoning literalist Orthodox Church, which became later, of course, the Roman Catholic Church. The literalists, the Orthodoxy, and so on. No, it must be this and this and this. I think this is where you saw a lot of things in the New Testament. I think there's a lot of good stuff in the New Testament. I think if there is a message that Jesus is the absolute Son of God, who died, rose again, and takes away the sin of the world, it's buried in one of two things. Either it's a lie of Satan, who has deceived us all, because God's too weak to prevent him from doing that, or it is something that has been so changed over time that we don't understand what the real story was actually all about, and how the mystics claim that Jesus was a son of God because he was one of those that had risen to that status. He had gone above others, and they elevated him to the status of a son of God or a God-man, whereas Christianity paints a picture of being the Son of God, only begotten Son of God, as John 3:16 tells us. And so the big question I would ask, and I know I'm rabbit trailing a bit here, one of the questions I've asked is that, and we just talked about this not long ago again, if God, if hell is a literal place that is separation between God and his created humans for all, as the Bible says, eternity, I would say all infinity, unending separation from the love of God, where there could be, according to some biblical passages, weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, where the worm does not die and the flesh is not consumed by the fire. You've got all these elements of hell that are thrown in, all because somebody does not follow the message that the followers of Jesus were preaching, to accept Jesus as your personal Savior, that God wants none to perish. God wishes, the Apostle Paul said, that none should perish, but that all should have everlasting life. Yet he's prepared this place, this awful place, where for all infinity, just in case, you go, you fuck off. I don't want to have anything to do with this. Now, here's the big question I have. If all of that is true, why would an infinite God place on the minds of his obviously finite creation, with finite, limited knowledge of the universe, the afterlife, dimensions, and so on, that most finiteness of minds that lasts, if it lives an average lifespan, 70 to 100 years. And then they're gone, and they've got only that time to make that with their finite brains and understanding, that decision of infinite import with nothing but words written 2,000 years ago in old manuscripts.
Mm-hmm.
Is that all the more power that God has to, and I'm not challenging God here, I'm saying this is the thought process I go through. And so I have to look at that with the biblical stories as well. There are some of those things. Michael S. Heiser, somebody that I talked about who's a linguist and a scholar, he said something very profound. I had put it up on my Facebook the other day. He says we all have to accept one of two things. Either we live understanding that there is something greater than the reality we experience, or that this is it. And depending on how you make that decision will determine on what you believe by a faith issue. And by the way, that's the other issue that bothered me too, is why would such a monumentally infinite decision need to be made by faith alone? I understand when you get into spirituality and metaphysics and all of this stuff that, faith is because your heart is as your mind. I get all that. I get the esoterics of it. But I would be hard-pressed to really understand in its full impact why an infinite God would do that to his finite creation. So those are one of the questions. Those are some of the driving questions I had over the years. And that would also go to all this other stuff when we're extrapolating information from the Sumerian culture up into the Hebraic culture, up into the Old Testament and the Acts of the Old Testament. The history is intact, but the belief system, how do you know that is what was actually happening? You don't for sure.
You don't, and you're not ever going to know is the issue, and we're literally fighting wars. I mean,
Yes.
Speaking of the early church history, they were fighting they had schisms about what type of bread that they were going to use for the Eucharist. They were fighting about the types of bread that there were wars fought
What
for
kind
the
of bread?
Okay, so,
Yep.
And when you go back, I mean, the validity of it so many years ago, okay, you have the Nag Hammadi, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have all these scriptures that are from a non-Roman filtered lens, because that's the whole thing. The Nag Hammadi and all these things, they had to be hidden away because they were they're heretical, so they needed to be put in scrolls and tucked away in some cave for forever. And there's probably 100 different gospels of a whole bunch of different people. And so I go back even to the reason, one of the biggest versions that is one of the most used versions is the King James Version. If you look at the sketchy history of King James, I mean, and his associates, you know what I mean? It's like, how is it okay when these guys, supposedly Francis Bacon was editing the Bible and all this stuff? It's like, well, did they put Rosicrucian symbolism in there? How much of it is it's watered down and it's passed down.
That's
and
it.
I've always said that, I believe in magic and I believe in all that shit, the occult. I believe in all that stuff. And I feel that when we're using these things that we don't understand, these scriptures especially, if they had some hidden meaning within it, because that's the whole thing with alchemy and symbolism. With symbols, to the uninitiated, it's just whatever. It's nothing. It's it's just it's hieroglyphs. For the initiated, it's a whole different language. It's more intricate and has a deeper meaning than what is presented.
Well, isn't that the thing about what were the words for the interior and the exterior in ancient mysticism? There was the exoteric,
as
religion,
above, so below.
Yes, and then the
Hermeticism,
intrinsically internal.
Yeah, you have the exoteric and the esoteric, and the whole thing with that is how do you know if you're not carrying the intention of a magician or whoever it is further by you unintentionally reading this work and passing it forward? Because, like how you said, we're not ever gonna know, and that's the craziest part. But people die for this shit. And again, I believe in a God just how the Greeks believe. I consider myself an emanationist, where I do believe there's a source, and from that source, that emanates reality. Okay, the center. There's a source. There's a God. You have how you said you have the clear view of when they went from polytheism to monotheism, where it goes from all these multiple characters, Anu and Lil, Ea, whoever it is, and it trickles down to one figure. Well, let's make him three. Let's make him the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's like, well, that is literally the most confusing thing about Christianity. That is that aspect, and there's even paintings of Jesus with three faces that need to be taken down because they're like, that looks too pagan. You can't.
Well, I believe, and maybe this is what you're getting at too, is that was one of those, like etiology, like placing myth on top of something real in order to make it understandable. Maybe not meant to be diabolical,
literal,
but I believe it was. The Trinity was created to be able to accommodate that. Not because it existed and they had to figure out how to make it work. God revealed there's a Trinity. Well, did God reveal that, or is it? And it's so hard because I do believe that there is a God. I do believe there is a creator. I believe that I've started using the word originator, and I got to tell you, just as a wacky side trail, I did a big study on the djinn about a year and a half ago, and did a couple of weeks worth of shows, daily shows on the djinn, exploring that. And I went through, and I don't remember the guy's name, PhD in something, and he had his encounter with a djinn, and he wrote about this. And this was like listening to a Whitley Strieber talk about his UFO abduction experiences or alien abduction experiences in reading his stuff. And he said he actually had a conversation with. And it was interesting because the djinn are not demons. The djinn were created before demons.
Interesting.
And I mentioned Michael S. Heiser earlier. He talked about, when he was talking about belief in the things we put our faith in, he actually mentioned that there are beings that are gods that we cannot have power over, like the demons. They're different kinds, and only God deals with those. The Elohim, the bright shining princes of heaven, the council, the divine council, they're called.
The galactic, the Ashtar Galactic Command, maybe.
Yes, that basically the same thing. But the djinn, this man asked the djinn some questions. May I ask you questions? I said, please do. And it was asking him questions. And this wasn't a guy trying to set forward a new theology so he could start a cult, or just telling you these are the questions I was curious about and I wanted to know. They asked him about God, and he said, have you met God? And the answer was a little vague, but they said, God is not the same being that you would think of as your creator, the djinn said to him.
Was this on a Ouija board, Scotty, that they were using?
No, this was actually like a vision that he had. And he was traveling down the highway through the desert in Egypt for hours and riding in a vehicle. And he said it was not a dream.
You interviewed him?
By the way, I want to interview him. I haven't reached out to him yet.
Interesting.
But I read his account, and he said he had this vision, and he had another one because he sought it out. And he was told by this djinn that God isn't the creator. They're not the same. He says, that's the originator. He says, we call him the originator, but there is the God who is not the creator. And it went into all these things in describing, and I thought it was very interesting.
That sounds amazing.
If I can make a side note here, I've always wanted to come across as being fairly practical and pragmatic. When I do my studying, I don't want to go, I don't care what anybody thinks out there. I don't mean to offend anybody's spiritualities or sensibilities or anything, but I don't want to pray and go, and God revealed to my soul that this was this. And to me, I want to know things, and I want to know things more solidly than that. Richard Feynman, astrophysicist, theoretical physicist. He was a contemporary of Oppenheimer and Einstein and all. He said, for me, to doubt is the basic thing that moves me along in life. He says, I don't ever want to come to know something, even though I want to know things. He says, that's why we do this. He says, but I doubt. He says, I don't want to come to the end of my days and realize that the thing that I thought I knew was the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's no verification for it. And he wasn't an atheist, as far as I could tell. He was just a seeker. And I am kind of the same way with God, is that I want to know things. I'm trying to think of the exact point I was trying. There's so many different tendrils that this goes off to in my head. Is that looking at this whole thing when the djinn talked about? Oh, I was talking about the vision this guy had, and this is why I'm giving this little bit of background. Is that I've had at least one that I know of, a vision of my own. I am not given to that shit. I don't go out and go, oh, I had a vision last week, and here's what I was told by the Great Spirit. I don't do that. It's not that I discount people who have those experiences. It's that I don't, and I haven't sought to teach what I learned that way, because I don't want people to think I've sucked it out of my own thumb, and that I've made this stuff up, or that it's some bullshit spiritual experience that I had when I was on ayahuasca, or whatever it might be, or I was smoking pot one day and God revealed to me. I don't want to place my research into that category, but I had one experience that was like that. And it was in Egypt. It was at the stepped pyramid of Djoser. It was in the Hebsed Court, the broken down, tumbled ruins of the Hebsed Court. Right alongside, right over my shoulder was the stepped pyramid. And I'll share this with you for a second. There was no, as far as I've known, not a deeper spiritual implication like who is God or anything like that. But I'm sitting in this courtyard, and it's full of rubble that's been neatly lined up, and there's along the sides of this court, but figure about the size of like 2 basketball courts set end for end in length and about the same width, lined by temples that had these coved tops in the fronts and little porches out in front of each of them. And there's only 3 of them rebuilt, and the rest is all rubble. And I'm sitting on the rubble, and I'm having a cigarette on a rock. It's in the middle of the day. Nobody there.
A cigarette, Scotty? Nothing else. Just a cigarette.
Just a cigarette.
All right.
just tobacco. It was Cleopatra's Egyptian cigarette. And all the Egyptians would tell me, would you like to smoke? And I go, well, I got some. They go, well, I got Marlboro, Cowboy Man. And I said, well, I got Cleopatra's. And they go, oh, don't smoke those.
Is that a real thing, Cleopatra's?
Cleopatra's, yeah.
Really?
That's the brand over there.
What the fuck?
And so we'd smoke them like packs a day. That's the way we were when I was over there. And but anyway, I'm sitting there, I'm having a cigarette, and I'm looking at the ruins. The pyramid is right over my right shoulder, and nobody's there except John and I, my archaeologist friend. And all of a sudden, everything changes. The Hebsed Court, I'm looking at it in front of me. It's clear. It's like a sandy sand. It's soft sand, and it's lined. And all these temples, these cove temples, are all built. And coming out of the top of each one of the coves is a long, like 12-foot long torch, a big shaft, and they were all lit. And the sun is low in the sky. I see the shadow coming in at this angle over everything. The torches are all lit. I could feel the breeze. I could smell incense. And marching toward me from the other end of the court was a line of priests, what I interpreted as priests. They were all wearing the white kilts, bare-chested, bald, carrying silver platters with objects on them. And they all marched toward me and turned about 20 feet in front of me, turned to the right and marched over to the other side, which is about 25 feet away, to the other side. And I'm watching this, and they're chanting as they're going. I'm hearing the chanting, smelling the incense, feeling the breeze. And I blinked, and it was all back to the way it was before. And I had tears in my eyes. Not from emotion, but from, you get chills up your back, and you just go, whoa, and your eyes will water up. And it was kind of that kind of thing. And I'm like, what the fuck was that? Was my response. And I haven't figured it all out, but I've had so much happen to me since that's related to that. I got up and I walked across to the other side of the court, and I'm just looking around, and I took a bunch of pictures. And then John, he caught up to me, and we took off for the day. And I was looking, that was in 2013 that happened. I was looking back 2 years ago at those pictures for a friend of mine who was going there and wanted to go, well, what did you see? What was I go, I got these great pictures of the step pyramid in the Hebsed Court. And I called them up, and I'm showing them the pictures. I said, there's the stone I was sitting on when I was smoking, and I had this little vision thing. And I blew it up, and I'm scanning across. And on the left side, looking down the stonework, emerging from around the backside of the stonework is a figure. And this figure was black and brown with the sun shining off of like a big muscled shoulder and a bicep and an arm going down. You see the fingers and the thumb and the rib cage to the hip, and then it fades off. It cuts off about here, you don't see the face or the head. And it's emerging from behind the stonework. And now there was nobody there. The only people there were the guardians who were hired by the government to mind these sites. They're all Egyptian men from the villages. They all wear the galabeas. To every last person, the galabea, the long-sleeved robe that drops down to the ground. You've seen them in modern-day pictures, and that's how they all dressed, white or light blue. And this person was obviously a black skinned, dark-skinned, reflecting a bit in the sunlight, but it was tiny in the picture, and I had to blow it way up to look at it. And what was interesting about this is once I pulled back a little bit, this thing was about 9 feet off the ground.
What the fuck?
And I thought, what the hell am I looking at? And I showed this to a good friend of mine. You may know who this is, David Weatherly. He's an author. He authored books like the Black-Eyed Children and many other books.
I've heard the name, yeah.
And he was looking at this picture, and he came back and said, I have a feeling this is a djinn encounter.
Whoa.
And now other things that have happened to me since that seem to verify that. Now, this is way off the topic of Nephilim, way off the topic of Moses, of any of this stuff. But this is that experience that I had that I put in that vision category, that I say something happened here. And I had other experiences connected to it that seemed to indicate there was something very different about this experience. I've got the pictures. They're up on my Instagram. They're somewhere on my Facebook. I can show you these pictures someday. But if you go to my Instagram account, which is just, I think it's Mr. Scotty Roberts. If you go over there, you scroll way back about a year and a half in my pictures on my Instagram, you're going to see these pictures of the Hebsed Court and this character, this being. And so what did it all mean? I don't know for sure. Maybe I'm not thinking hard enough about it. Maybe it's as plain as the nose on my face. But I saw that, and it started to tie into a lot of the things that I was doing in Egypt, a lot of the things I was writing about at the time. This was in 2013, so 9 years ago. And ever since then. So something is telling me. So now I had,
were you scared when you saw that?
No, I saw it in the photo, so I didn't see it when it happened. That's the thing.
But did you feel any sense of dread when that was happening?
I felt no dread. I had that vision of the priests marching, and I came out of that, and I was like, wow, that was freaky. And I was talking to John about it, and I said, I can't make an end out of this. Well, it was very interesting that his wife, who is Dr. Maria Nilsson, she is the Swedish, she's Swedish, she's the head of their archaeological mission at Gebel El Silsila in Egypt, big quarry site. She told me on that trip, because of other things that had happened, she said, Scotty, she said, back in Sweden, she says, I am a witch. She says, here I am an academic. And she said, and they've got their feet in both worlds. And she said, I had an experience a week later than that experience at the tomb of Senenmut, this guy. And she was the one that told me, you need to go back down into the grotto down there. It's like a big ditch off the main road. You need to go back down there and sit and ask for clarity. Now, you would never know this about her when you see her. John and she are on Nat Geo all the time with their site and different things that they do around Egypt. They have put that site archaeologically back on the map. They don't do a lot of talking about the woo side of things for that reason, because they are in the academic circle of scholars. And so she says, we have to keep these things kind of separated. But she acknowledges it. And she's one of the first ones who told me a week after that experience, she said, I had a vision of my own. She said, here in the house, in their house in Luxor. And she said, I had a little girl that was putting her hand out. And it was basically for you and John, saying that you guys are on the right path. You just need to take my hand, she said. And I said, what does that mean? She said, I don't know exactly. And this is when we were writing the book on Moses, and which is was right there. Oh, there it is.
That's a hell of a synchronicity. I mean, that
people can see that. You know, that was the book that John and I were writing. And I just pulled my headset out of my ear reaching for that. So give me a second here and I'll plug that back in. But I don't have any of the pictures of that in here.
So that's a hell of a synchronicity, because I mean, we have, I have synchronicities every now and again, but you know, I've never had anything supernatural that I know of, right, happen to me in that sort of way where you see something and all this stuff. But I would have been freaked the fuck out.
We left the supernatural out of this book. Just to give you an idea, this book, by the way, is filled with all the pictures of John and I when we were doing this trip. And I was a month over there when this all happened. And there's like 16 pages of color in this book of all these different things. And then black and white photos throughout the whole book. This was a fun book. But the experience was amazing, and the things that happened when I was there and the stuff I saw. If you want a little bit of a paranormal, I was there the next year, well, a couple of years later. I'd been there 4 or 5 times. The last time I was there, we were at their archaeological site, which is about 100 miles south of Luxor on the Nile River, one of the narrowest points in the river. And they have a big, their archaeological site spans 23 square miles of the desert on both sides of the river. And what's there are all these quarry sites and ancient quarries going back to prehistorical times. They have rock art all the way up into almost modern day where they're pulling stone out of those quarries, but all through the dynastic period. I went out, there's a line of shrines all along the west bank of the river. They were working over on the east bank. They took the little boat launch over every morning, and they were working on Big Hill that was the stables of Tiberius Caesar, his period that was there on the site. And so I'm going through all these different shrines all along, and I'm walking down about a mile and a half down the river from our dig house was a big boat, a big dahabeah, moored up at the river at the riverfront there. And so I walked down by myself, and I'm going through all these shrines, and I noticed there's one spot. This is about as paranormal as it gets. One spot, I walked into a shrine, and I started talking. I was doing some filming, and my camera died. Then my other camera died. And I said, I just had full batteries on this. And which seemed like very paranormal TV show. So begrudgingly, I'm like, fuck. And I got to walk all the way back to the boat and get my batteries. And I went to take out the batteries, and they were fully charged again. So there are things there. And there was one day when we were sitting on the boat, and there was a story of one of the Egyptian workers for the archaeological site. They were all working, and there were guys on the boat, and he comes running out of the rocky hillside on the west bank, screaming. He saw a djinn in the hillside and was scared to death and ran onto the boat and down into the hold where they slept at night. And one by one, all the Egyptian workers over the next 5 minutes all come filing out, and they all get on the boat, they go down in the hold, and they smoke shisha all night long. They would not go on shore until the next morning again. And so there was all of that was there. That stuff was there. And it's bad when the locals are freaking out about it, because they're around it all the time. But I 100% believe in lower vibrational entities and other things outside the fabric of reality. And I feel that a lot of these places, the reason that they're built there is because the veil is thinner in these areas. And I feel that has to do as well with a lot of these civilizations that just get up and go. The Mayans and all the, Mohenjo-Daro. You have different areas around the world where people just up and disappear. And I think it has to do something with the vibrational frequencies and the veil. Sometimes you just trip over, some woo-woo cord, and there you are through a wormhole, or having visions, how you said, it's just like that. Exactly.
That's really amazing, Scotty. And any closing thoughts as we bring this to an end? I want to share with the listeners that you have been to Egypt, and you have been and seen all these places. So you're not just some, keyboard archaeologist that's just sitting around at home, reading stories online and all this shit.
Right. Although a good writer can put himself there. Some of the best science fiction writers I know have never traveled interstellarly, but but they can write about it.
Yeah.
So I was just talking to John today, John Ward, my friend who wrote this book with me, my British archaeologist friend. We were just talking about this very thing today. We hadn't talked for a couple of months, and just recounting some of this stuff and stuff we'd seen and been through and done, and so any closing thoughts I would have is something I've said for a long time is don't let anybody tell you what you should believe. Go out there and figure it out. Even the Apostle Paul, if I can hail to New Testament Christianity, and I have reason to believe the Apostle Paul hijacked Christianity. I don't think his writings were invalid, but I think he's presenting Pauline Christianity. He was a Herodian, and as opposed to Peter, who was a Jewish Christian, as opposed to and so on. But Paul had said, work out your own salvation with fear and respect, meaning work it out, figure out what you believe, know what you believe. But he was a firm preacher of the gospel. So he said, you've got to work these things out, and you've got to find out how they work for you. You got to work it out for yourself, your own religion, your own practice. So in a sense, I'm kind of there. God forbid that I'm wrong about everything I think. But like Feynman said, I don't want to come to the end of my life and realize everything that I believed was the wrong thing. So to doubt for me is a keystone to existence. I doubt, and it makes me question. And when I question, I look for answers. So that's really where I am on a lot of this stuff. There's so much. I'll tell you what there is. I know we're closing here, but This is that thing that Michael S. I. Heiser said, and I put this up on my social media yesterday. And he said, so how does all of this relate to today? He's referring to something he was talking about. He says, it doesn't relate at all if you don't believe in an unseen reality. If you do, it puts an Old Testament context to what we think of as spiritual warfare, one that goes far beyond mere demons. Demons are lightweight in comparison, mere irritants. The gods are something altogether different. And he uses a small g there for gods. He says, we can presume no authority to confront them, unlike demons. They are celestial ones, against whom even angels dare not blaspheme. They will only be dealt with by God, and equal spiritual powers God tasks with doing so. And then he talks about we're mere agents on the earth. He's speaking to Christians. Our task is to spread the gospel, he said, which is the thing that those beings fear the most. Spreading the gospel isn't an intellectual exercise. It's not a debate to win. People without Christ are under dominion, their minds darkened. The war is spiritual in nature and so must be engaged in on that level. We're only agents. Opposition, failure, and success must be viewed in that light. Not intellect, not cleverness, not, God forbid, good marketing. You either believe you are part of something bigger than the reality you can discern, or you don't. And that's kind of, I think, where I end up being, not on every point he's making there, but I look at that and I say, here, I lost my window, so I can't even see what I'm doing right now. But I find myself being in that position where I'm an agent of something. I have to either accept that there's a greater reality than who I am and what I am, or that it's something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And so
maybe we'll wake up one day.
Yeah.
Once we pass on, we'll wake up in some other body, some other light body or something. Like, damn, we were all fucking wrong about this whole thing. Just
that's it.
Go on and
I've had contact through psychics, no matter what power you put in this, people who were very instrumental. My mentor when I was a young boy, who led me into the faith that I believed, somebody connected with him, and they connected to him through things that they would never have known from my life. And you hear people say that all the time. This is literal. There were things that they brought up that he said he's doing this. He's whole subject idea to let you know that this is who you're actually talking to. So there's either some diabolical mimicry going on there, or this was the guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he said one thing he wanted me to know. He said he wants you to know he's proud of you and where you've gone and so on, but also that it's very different over here than we thought.
Interesting.
Meaning from that very Baptist fundamentalist point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gotten that a couple of times from people where that message is given to me. So it's either, like I say, it's diabolical mimicry, or there's something to that. It's different than what we thought it was going to be, he said.
Absolutely. Scotty, I would love to have you back on again to talk some
Anytime,
reptilians or Nephilim, because we didn't even get to talk about that. Can you?
Not much, sorry.
Hey, you're good. You're good. This was amazing. Can you plug your social media once more, where people can find your work so they can look you up and listen to your show?
You can go to my website, scottallenroberts.com, and Allen is ALAN, so scottallenroberts.com. It's got links to all my social media over there. You can see everything I've done. If I can just plug my most recent book, which isn't a book like the ones we've been talking about. This is it right here. It's called The Sword and the Clay, and it's only that thick. It's only 8,000 words, and it's a book that's about a story of a true story of World War I soldier who found a Roman gladius, this kind of sword, in the clay after the bombing of Amiens in World War I.
Oh.
And
you illustrated the whole thing, right?
I illustrated this as well. Well, there you can see just on the cover. That's some of my illustration work on the cover. But I created a fictional character who's plausible to give a backstory to the sword. And so it's all about Will Bird is the Canadian soldier, his paranormal experiences, the ghost of his brother saving his life. These were all in his memoirs that he wrote after World War One. And so I put it all into a cogent story and talked about this. So you might enjoy that.
Awesome, Scotty. Send me you already sent me your links. So if not, send me your links. Yes. I'll post them in the description. And I want to thank you again, Scotty, for coming on and taking time.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Juan.
Thank you,
My
Scotty.
pleasure.
Well, that was it. I'll see you guys on the other side. Thank you so much.